Feels like just yesterday that we had a regional championship or some other event in order to go over in coverage, but here we are again. This time it was the North American Regional Championship Round 2, Electric Boogaloo, over in Charlotte, and it was the modern format once again. So although we wound up seeing this just a few weeks ago in Portland, because our country is so big and there's so many players in the United States, they divided it up into two this season, and now we get the second part of it. So in this video of going over Regional Championship Charlotte, we're going to do a TLDR of the top 8, a metagame breakdown of everything that was played in the room at the event and how much of it was actually there. Then we're going to transition and look at just the most popular decks and how they did compared to one another. Then shift our gears a little bit and take a look at the top 10 win rate decks at Charlotte, regardless of the number of copies in the room. And then finally wrap it all up by looking at the top 10 presence decks, aka the ones with the most copies in the room, and seeing how they matched up head to head so that you could see what you may want to bring to your LGS or start potentially picking some cards up for as the RCQ season for Standard winds down and Modern will be picking up in basically less than a month from this video. So without further ado, let's recap Regional Championship Charlotte. Now, the story of the event is the fact that there were a lot of grinding breach decks, a lot of Orzhov blink decks, and pretty much what everybody was expecting to see. So I won't go through the entirety of the top 8 recap in a bunch of details, since a lot of it is honestly going to be grinding breach mirrors, because you can see the top 8 had 6 copies of that archetype in the top 8, in addition to a singleton copy of Boros Energy, which was still clinging on for dear life, as well as the fellow combo deck in the room at the top of the tables in Amulet Titan to round out that top 8. Now, in the quarterfinals, Breach took down Titan, but Energy managed to kind of hang on a little bit and made it to the semifinals to only make 75% of the top 4 decks the grinding Breach archetype. However, it was defeated, which caused an all-Breach finals, which had a pretty decent story behind absolutely everything, though. We saw the hot streak from now Regional Championship champion Jesse Robkin go from LCQ the day before to RC victory, besting the Breach mirror from one of the deck's earliest advocates. Congratulations, Jesse. Now, before we breach the subject of what all the decks that were being played in the room looked like, I have to give my spiel about my data caveats, as always. Now, I am using all of the data from the Melee GG platform, which has 1,327 registered players, which condensed into 99 deck archetypes, although there were 98 if you don't count the ones that I've grouped together as troll lists. Now, if you might remember from Portland, I was thinking about combining all these together into a big RC recap video, which I still may do. But as I was looking through a couple of the lists, I noticed that there were some troll lists in Charlotte, such as the 10-rack list, which was 60 lands. The 5-color creativity list, which was 60 copies of Slimes Against Humanity in the main deck and 14 in the sideboard with an Umori companion. An Abzan affinity list that was also 60 lands, but this one had 15 extra in the sideboard just in case they wanted to pivot. So yeah, I kind of just grouped all of those under the deck archetype of troll deck list because I seriously don't know what people will get out of this. I guess there's some sort of entry thing for going, but whatever. In addition to renaming these troll deck lists and omitting them from the data, I have swapped the naming convention of some of the decks that were labeled as Orzhov Midrange. Now, this is because there were 2 very distinct archetypes that both fell into this kind of umbrella mantra that I guess people just decided to call their deck. So they weren't doing this one maliciously. They just didn't necessarily know which one they wanted to put their name down as. So there was Orzhov Blink, which had the majority of the share, and Orzhov Necrodominance, which had a couple of copies of the deck. So I've sussed out those lists and spread them out accordingly. So with all that data cleanup out of the way, let's get into what the room looked like in Charlotte at the Regional Championship. Now, as I mentioned before, there are 99 archetypes on here, but only 98 of them were actually serious, as one is grouped together as those troll archetypes. But there were 44 of these archetypes with the only copy in the room at Charlotte, which was a large 44.9% of the meta, making up almost half of the decks in the room. Meanwhile, there are 11.2% of the decks, or 11 archetypes with 2 copies. 8 archetypes wind up having 3 copies in the room for just a little bit higher than 8.2% of the metagame. Meanwhile, decks with 4 copies in the room, there were 7 of those. There was 7.1% of the metagame share from those archetypes, which then meant that the leftover part of the room with 6 or more decks in there was 29 different archetypes for 29.6% of the decks in the room. And unfortunately, there were no decks that had 5 copies of an archetype in the room. Now, if you paid any attention to coverage at all during the weekend, you'll know that the big thing of the RC was the fact that Grinding Breach was the most played deck by a long shot. 300 pilots in the room for 22.6% of the metagame. That's almost a quarter of the RC all playing the same deck. Now, not too far behind it, although it looks like it, is the Orzhov Blink list with a 15.2% share of the metagame and 202 decks to its archetype's name, which would normally be astronomical numbers if it wasn't paired right next to the Grinding Breach Station deck. Likewise, Eldrazi Ramp had 160 copies in the room for 12.1% of the metagame share, which is also a lot of decks. Now, if you look at just these top 3 archetypes combined, you get 49.9% of the room was on one of these decks, which, although we had so many copies of decks with only 1 copy in the room, still most of the people playing at the event were going to be playing one of these 3 decks. Now, behind them by a bit of a margin was Boros Energy, still hanging on to a top spot in the metagame, at least popularity-wise, with 120 decks and a 9.0% share of the field. Then there was the other combo deck in the room, Amulet Titan, at 92 decks, or 6.9% of the meta, for a nice share. Domain Zoo, meanwhile, popped back up a little bit with 53 pilots in the room and a 4.0% share of the RC metagame, while Dimir Midrange plucked out its eyes and just kept the Murktides and the Frogs with 30 pilots for a 2.3% share of the metagame. Jeskai Energy splashed blue in there for 20 copies with a 1.5% share of the metagame, while Dimir, Mill, and Orzhov Necrodominance rounded out the top 10 decks in the room with 19 pilots apiece with 1.4% share of the overall metagame at the RC. Now that we have a high-level view of what was in Charlotte, let's break it down a little bit with the popularity tiers. Now, these are going to be ranking all of the different archetypes in the room from S all the way down to D based on how many copies there were, and this just gives us a way to pinpoint how well they did in comparison to the other decks within their tier, so you can see if popular equals good or popular did not quite make the cut. Now, Grinding Breach had the most decks by a large margin and is the biggest outlier here, but also had an above 50% win rate by a decent amount of percentage points. Now, thanks to the large sample size of games, we can even see that the adjusted win rate gap is much smaller than we're used to seeing here. So that little bar on those Frank Karsten graphs is going to be teeny tiny. Now, having a deck with such a high win rate with so many people playing the deck is a sure sign of the deck's strength, although it did have its own fair share of pilots who did not perform well this weekend. However, Breach was the only one of the S tier decks to have a positive win rate on the weekend overall, as both Orzhov Blank and Eldrazi Ramp fell below 50%, with the Eldrazi deck taking a significant nosedive from previous events down to a 45.7% win rate. Now, despite the hype for the former deck, Orzhov Blink, it didn't really put up the greatest results and wound up having some below average performances in the hands of so many players in the room. So although we'll go into what matchups may have caused this kind of dip in win rate a little bit later on in the video. So despite the large skewing of deck numbers towards Breach and Orzhov at the RC, we do still have other tiers of decks. Though it's a little bit lonely all by itself in A tier, Boros Energy was still a popular enough version to have 120 pilots on the deck, although it did fall from S tier in Portland to A tier here in Charlotte, showing a lot of people pivoted from the deck choice. Now it looks like they may have been right after all, so long as the deck they swapped to had a higher than the 46.7% win rate overall like the Boros Energy deck did. Now, likewise, in B tier, there's just one deck here as well. Amulet Titan. For the combo-centric player that didn't want to slog through the Breach mirrors perceivably all day long and maybe have an edge in some other matchups, the Titan deck provided an above-average choice to switch to with a 51.6% win rate overall, with just under 100 players in the room searching their libraries for land and floating mana with their amulets. Now, if you want a little bit of different deck variety, there's no need to fear, because C tier is here, and C tier is home to 8 other decks with varying amounts of players on the archetype, from the 53 domain Zoo players to the 14 of Jeskai control. And one of those was clearly a better choice than the other for this event. Dimir Midrange, former home to Frog, Oculus, and Murktide, decided to gouge its eyes out. Or, well, drop the abhorrent Oculus and Unearth package in most cases, and soared up to a 53.7% win rate on the weekend in doing so. A blue splash in the energy deck put up an above-average win rate results in the hands of 20 players, while the other C-tier decks unfortunately fell below the coveted 50% win rate line, although Orzhov Necrodominance and Mono Blue Belcher got pretty close with 49.4 and 49.6% win rates respectively. And if win rates interest you, then stay tuned, because we're going to go over the top 10 most winning decks in the room at the RC in Charlotte. Now, this of course is based on overall win rate and does not differentiate between decks with more than one copy or not. So if you only have one copy and you have a pretty decent record, you're going to be towards the top of this list. Now, also to note that some of these win rates did not mean the deck made day 2. If you wind up having a 5-4 record, for instance, you could potentially be in these top 10 decks, because that still puts you at an above 55% win rate. So remember, when looking at these lists, sample size is key, and this is not an overall painting of power level of these decks across the format. Is this a Splinter Twin situation? Temur Twin put a cascading twist on the archetype, trading in the older Temur Twin style for Shardless Agent and Crashing Footballs combo, in addition to the 4 copies of Splinter Twin and a Singleton Deceiver Exarch. Now, there were also 4 copies of Bounding Grixis in this deck, which allowed for a higher power twin target to do the same thing Exarch can do, but it can only tap or untap creatures. Keeping everything else above 2 mana means that you do have to cut down on some of your interaction package, but you do get to do the annoying Fire Ice thing, and Stock Up is a solid way to dig for either one of these combos. Now, 4-color Omnath had a single deck doing the elemental thing like the olden days, having Risen Reef hopefully plop lands into play for everyone's favorite elemental jelly bean to trigger multiple times on. Now, if that's not the case, then Wrenn and 6 will help you get all those fetch lands back to ensure that you get many triggers, or similarly, just 6. The Modern Horizons 3 card that flips over, that can do similar things. Go figure, maybe it's part of the other card. All while Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, can double the effects of your triggers. 5-color humans, that's one more than Omnath, rose up again with a 9-6 list that ran a core package of everybody's favorite hits from 2018-ish modern times, while playing some of the newer or more recently legal humans from other formats. Like Sylvan Safekeeper allowed our lands to protect key humans like Meddling Mage, while Adeline Resplendent Cathar gave us a growing clock alongside a token generator, which worked wonders alongside not just Thalia's Lieutenant, but also Guide of Souls. Energy, baby! Boros Control was more akin to Boros minus the energy package, although it didn't go full blink with like multiple overlords or a flicker wisp type thing. Now instead, the deck main decked 4 copies of Wrath of the Skies and 4 copies of Path to Exile to play a much grindier game alongside Felia and Flage to, help close out said games. Now, 3 Seasoned Pyromancer and 4 Fable the Mirror Breaker added card selection, while Aven Interrupter played the role of counterspell for a color pairing that didn't include blue for any permission. Now, Izzet Storm decided that the Ruby Medallion wasn't good enough and swapped back to Baral Chief of Compliance alongside Ral Monsoon Mage and a Singleton Goblin Electromancer to really overload on the cost reducers for its spell-based combo deck. Now, the addition of Stock Up, which could in theory be cast for a Singleton blue mana here, which is pretty broken, gave the deck a massive value in the card selection category, with its big sibling Dig Through Time still on the ban list, hopefully forever. But Stock Up for 1 mana does a pretty broken impression of this even at sorcery speed. However, it allowed the deck to get key rituals or Past in Flames, or if it needed Grape Shot at the point in time, but it let you dig multiple cards deep, find 2 of them, and ensure that your combo was going to go beyond plenty of damage needed. 5-color Creativity had 2 lists that ran the same package of creatures to find: Archon of Cruelty and the big bad Valgavoth Terror Eater. Now, packing enough lands to hit domains so that Prismatic Ending and Leyline Binding were able to be used to their full effect, the deck packed the red combo cards alongside a core of Azorius Permission cards, with Consign to Memory, Spell Snare, and Reprieve in the main deck. Now, green here allowed for cards like Paw Patch Formation in main deck as an answer to specific creatures, a hate spell for enchantments, or, most importantly, a token generator to enable our creativity. Ad Nauseam had a list. What year is it? Now, you might think with humans coming back into this as well that Modern is healing. But I need to ruin your day for a moment. Now, this quote-unquote Ad Nauseam list did not have the namesake card in it. Nope, 0 copies of Ad Nauseam. Instead, it still rocked the Angel's Grace in order to stay alive through a large Spoils of the Vault by naming a card that isn't in your library while a Thassa's Oracle trigger is on the stack, so you just win the game that way. Same type of functionality as more recent versions of the deck, but not the same Lotus Bloom style with the 5 mana spell alongside it. So, what do we want to call this one? Spoils of Mill? Oracle of the Vault? Or do you just keep the legacy of the old deck name just for shits and giggles? Now, Grixis Creativity cut 2 colors, but also had a deck in the room, although this one was a little more straightforward and only wanted to find Archon of Cruelty in Game 1, with sideboarding of Terastodon for other games, alongside a sideboard copy of a Singleton Through the Breach in case the Search or Graveyard package was turned off. Now, back over in the main deck, the Grixis version had 4 copies of Persist in order to hit that Archon of Cruelty from the graveyard off of an early Faithless Looting. Now, this could in theory enable the combo as early as turn 2, compared to the 5-color deck that could only do so by as late as turn 4. You're too slow.
Rakdos Death Shadow showed up in multiples, combining a small discard Midrange package with Inti, Seneschal of the Sun, to give our hopefully large creatures trample, as well as Detective's Phoenix to add flying and haste to our Death Shadows and Nethergoyfs. Now the deck also featured 3 copies of the new Aetherdrift vehicle, The Last Ride, which is basically a Death Shadow with crew that can lose us some life during combat and make that math awkward for our opponents, as well as, giving us card advantage. Now there is a Arena of Glory and Kroxa to provide a similar Titanic level finisher that Flage offers in the Boros and Jeskai versions of these decks, just with the potential for slightly less damage if they still have cards in their hand. 7 copies of Eldrazi Tron had some variation between their lists, but they were all rocking the Urza's Lands, Eldrazi Temples, Ugin's Labyrinth, and things of various sizes to place under said Ugin's Labyrinths. Now, in most cases, this involved Devourer of Destiny, thanks to the scry-like effect that it can provide from your hand, but some lists went all the way to Big Bad Sire of 7 Deaths as a thing to put under the Labyrinth, and as a many keyworded replacement for the old Reality Smasher angle of attack. Now, Kozilek's Command and Glaring Fleshraker combined together to deal a lot of damage together, if you could chain commands, while All Is Dust was a mostly one-sided board wipe to ensure games ended with a bang. Alright, now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the top 10 Presence decks in the room and see how they wound up battling against each other head to head. Now, this is going to look at the most played decks at the Regional Championship and then give you a matchup matrix broken down by their record against one another. This is going to give you a quick overall look at the top tiers of the metagame. So if you are thinking about bringing one of these decks or preparing to play against these decks at your LGS or your upcoming Modern event, this can give you a bit of insight into how those matchups may wind up going, although this is not a be-all, end-all of the format. It's just a snapshot for sample size. All right, top dog of the format, Grinding Breach, had one of the highest overall win rates for the top 10 decks in the room, while also having an impeccable matchup spread against the top of those top 10 copies. There's a 54.3% win rate against fellow top S tier category popularity deck Orzhov Blink, as well as a almost 61% win rate against the Eldrazi Ramp deck. Now, even though it was a matchup of speed matters in some of these Titan versus Breach matchups, Breach still wound up being able to get the better of the other combo deck in an almost 56% win rate, which is the same as it had against the Domain Zoo deck that was trying to go faster or bigger than the deck was. Now, on the bottom end of the top 10 Presence decks, where there were less copies of these decks in the room, Breach started having losing records against Jeskai Energy, Dimir Mill, and the Orzhov Necrodominance deck. So all of these decks that kind of had solid game plans or interaction plans for the Breach deck specifically were where it wound up struggling just a little bit. But granted, these are the smallest sample size of this top 10 Presence decks, so I am not saying that these decks are the Breach killers. Now, another archetype that had a lot of hype going into the weekend was the Orzhov Blink deck, which unfortunately, as we saw, had a below 50% win rate and overall, and actually struggled against the other 2 S-tier popularity decks. The Grinding Breach Station deck was a 45.7% win rate matchup for Blink, whereas the Eldrazi Ramp deck was also a 46.4% matchup win rate for the Blink deck. Now, it started to pick up more win rate as we go down in the top 10 Presence decks, but even then it didn't have a great performance against Titan, and it kind of struggled against the other black-white deck in Orzhov Necrodominance. So although there was a lot of hype going into the event against the top decks in the room, it didn't necessarily have a great showing. Now, it did wind up still beating up on the Boros version of the energy deck, but when they added blue, it started getting a little bit more difficult for it. So Orzhov Blink may be the best of these quote-unquote fair decks in a fair versus fair matchup, but I don't think it's going to be the greatest against the unfair decks. Now, the Eldrazi Ramp deck actually had a worse overall performance than the Orzhov Blink deck. However, it made up for some percentage points at the top of the metagame by beating up on Blink and also having a good matchup win rate against Boros Energy. Now, the Eldrazi deck has struggled against the Grinding Breach deck in the past, so seeing at a 39.1% win rate in that head-to-head is not surprising to me, nor is it to see the 36.8% win rate against the Titan matchup, which is another potentially combo, potentially fast matchup for the deck that wants to still eventually get to some big Eldrazi, even if it gets there pretty quickly. Surprisingly, the Eldrazi deck had a very hard time against Dimir Mill, a 27.8% win rate in 18 games, not the largest sample size in the world, but it might be enough to just start putting that 15 mana Emrakul back in your sideboard as a one of, just in case you run into Mill. Boros Energy is not the beast of the format that it used to be, with losing matchups against 4 of the top 10 Presence decks in the room. Although it wasn't the worst against Grinding Breach, it was actually the worst against the Orzhov Blink deck. It also struggled against Amulet Titan out of all of those decks, so it didn't actually start picking up win rate until you got to like the C tier popularity decks and below, which is where the Boros Energy deck kind of shined in this tournament. It had an astounding 72.7% win rate against the Orzhov Necrodominance deck and a pretty decent 50% win rate or higher against some of the other fair decks, including a 53.3% win rate in the color shifted mirror against the Jeskai version of Energy. Amulet Titan did not pan out great against Grinding Breach, but did against the field in general, having a pretty decent overall win rate on the weekend, and then had a good showing against the other top decks in the room. 60% win rates or higher against Orzhov Blink, Eldrazi Ramp, and Boros Energy is a pretty solid place to be if you can shore up your Grinding Breach matchup just a teeny tiny bit. You even wind up having a 71.8% win rate against the Domain Zoo matchup. So you're looking pretty good if like 6 of the archetypes in this top 10 area are what you're going to be running into in your local game store. Now, of course, Modern is a very diverse format, and we saw how many one-of decks there are, so as you trickle down and have decks that are a little bit more teched against you that you just have to try to combo through, you start to struggle a little bit more, as we see losing records against decks like Dimir Midrange and the Dimir Mill decks. Now, Domain Zoo was another deck that kind of popped back up into more popularity and did pretty decent on the weekend with a 51.2% overall win rate. However, I don't think it had the greatest showing against Breach. It was still a 44% win rate matchup, but it was still on the slightly losing end of that, and it didn't necessarily make up for how it fared in some of the other matchups from the B tier and up popularity decks. Now, while it did do decent into Orzhov Blink and Eldrazi Ramp, the sheer amount of Boros Energy still hanging on here meant there is another below average matchup in the top decks, as well as having a 28.2% win rate against Amulet Titan, tanking the win rate a little bit if you're just looking at these top 5 decks played. Now, the Domain Zoo deck is fast, can kind of be considered fair, but also out of nowhere can just throw down giant creatures on like turn 2 and 3 and just win the game from that point forward. So against some of the other decks like Dimir Midrange or even the Orzhov Necrodominance deck that doesn't really put creatures on the battlefield and needs to bide its time a little bit, the Domain Zoo deck can just kill them very quickly and had good showings in these small sample size matchups. Now, Dimir Midrange was another deck that kind of came back to a bit more popularity than expected and had the highest overall win rate of these top 10 Presence decks at 53.7% on the weekend. Now, its head-to-head against the top 10 Presence decks in the room, however, was a little bit more scattered. Close to, but still under 50% win rate against Grinding Breach meant that it wasn't going to be the best deck in the room by far, but it also struggled against the Orzhov Blink deck at a 44.7% head-to-head matchup win rate there. Now, it did wind up preying upon some of the more fair decks, like the Boros Energy deck, or potentially the Jeskai version of it, but it did wind up having a slightly below average performance, or I guess in this case, poor performance, against the Domain Zoo deck in just 14 matches at a 35.7% win rate. So if you're going to be sleeving up those Murktides, you got to make sure that this Dimir deck is in a metagame that you know is coming, and potentially put in a couple of extra sideboard options for Breach or Blink, and you might be hitting that slightly above 50% win rate, which is like 100% win rate to Murktide pilots. A blue splash in energy for Jeskai had a good win rate against the Grinding Breach deck, which is the first of these top 10 Presence decks that we can say that. 57.1% win rate against the most played deck in the room is a great place to be, as well as having a 54.5% win rate against the second most played deck in the room in Orzhov Blink. So you might be thinking that, oh man, this Jeskai Energy deck might have one of the best overall win rates on the weekend. Unfortunately, it only had a 50.8%, which is still good. You're above average, but you wind up struggling against the other decks in the room because you are potentially a little too teched against the top decks. And while you did wind up playing the most matches against those decks, you didn't have enough pilots in the room to really kind of skyrocket that win rate. And then you wind up losing out against some of the lesser played matches, like 0% win rate against the Orzhov Necrodominance deck in 2 games, and a 28.6% win rate in the 7 games played against the Domain Zoo matchup. So while Jeskai Energy looks like it could be a better version of Boros for the top 2 decks in the format right now, who knows how long they're going to wind up staying up there, and you may want to wait on pulling the trigger to switch from Boros to Jeskai, unless you don't mind having the extra cards around. Temur Mill is not what I expected to see at the RC, let alone in hands of players like Jake Beardsley. Now, overall, the archetype only had a 46.7% win rate on the weekend, but looking at the spread against the top 10 Presence decks, it was very specifically targeting a couple of them. Mainly, it had a better win rate than Jeskai Energy did against the Grinding Breach deck at 58.8%. And it also had a pretty solid Eldrazi matchup at 72.2%. Guess they need their 15 mana Emeralds after all. It also wound up having a decent showing at a 60% win rate against the Amulet Titan lists. Now, unfortunately, it had a below 50% win rate against Orzhov Blink, and then was struggling in some of the lesser played matches, like against the Dimir Murktide mid-range decks with a 0% win rate there, and the Orzhov Necrodominance decks where a 0% win rate there. So Mill may be a little bit specialized for what was coming to this RC and what the top players thought they'd be playing against. And I don't know if I would say this is like a top contender in a broad open field. All right, now rounding out the top 10 Presence decks in the room is the Orzhov Necrodominance deck, which, if you didn't watch the coverage, Joe Lissette had a deck tech on his version of this archetype that you can go back and watch if you so choose, or you can just look at the Melee website and see what all the different pilots are playing. However, this was the best deck out of the top Presence decks against the Grinding Breach deck, with a 65.8% win rate in 38 head-to-head matches. Now, the Orzhov Necrodominance deck also had good win rates against Eldrazi Ramp and the Orzhov Blink deck. So a 52.4% win rate against Orzhov Blink in 21 matches and a 56% win rate against Eldrazi Ramp in 25 matches. Sure, smaller sample size, less pilots in the room, but this starts to beg the question of, should you be playing the Orzhov version of Necrodominance over the Orzhov version of Blink just because it has a better head-to-head win rate against these top-tier decks? And again, it starts to question, why is the win rate not higher? A 50.9% overall win rate on the weekend is nothing bad, but it means that it struggled in other areas, like against Boros Energy. 27.3% win rate and only 11 matches played means that if Energy starts ticking back up, especially if Breach potentially leaves the equation in the modern format, and the Orzhov Necrodominance deck might not be the dominant version of Orzhov anymore. So if you think your metagame is going to have more Energy decks, the Blink deck is where you want to be. If you think it's just going to be Breach and the Blink deck's trying to counteract the other stuff, you can counter that metagame with the Orzhov Necrodominance deck. The
the RCs are done, at least for a little bit, which gives me a bit of a break on doing these recap videos, probably until the Magic Spotlight series over in the Netherlands winds up happening in like, I think it's like a month and a half time or so. But with Modern kind of coming up to the regional championship qualifier season fairly soon, but also a ban announcement looming over the format, I know it may be a little bit difficult to get kind of hyped up about what we just saw at the regional championship, because there's always the fact of the matter that something may not be there by the time we build our own decks for the RCQ season. Now, I know that a lot of people have a couple of different events that they may or may not be traveling for. There are NRG events. There's an MXP event that's in San Jose that I'm actually going to be going to that has Modern and Standard as featured events. So if you are coming to that event, first off, you can say hi to me. I'll be there. A couple of friends, a couple of people from Card Art, the local store that we do our streams from. So just come up and say hi if you feel like doing so, or you can defeat me in the Modern or Standard portion of the event. But if you're looking for a deck to play for that event, hopefully this video has given you a little bit of insight, even if things are still a little bit up in the air come April when some of those events are happening. But if there's something that has caught your eye, especially from those top win rate decks, let me know what you're thinking of playing in the comments down below. And while you're there, you can give a thumbs up to the video and like it so I can see how many people are going to potentially see me in MXP in April. But you could always, of course, join the members to my channel, who I want to give a quick shout out for helping support this video specifically, as well as all of the videos that get published on my channel. Now, if you want to get member benefits like these fine folks do, such as Discord access, you can talk to me about Magic decks all day long when I'm supposed to be working, personal deck text so I can respond and give suggestions as to what you may or may not be missing from all your different types of lists, or just early access to all of the content that I am going to be posting, since I will be taking a small vacation towards the end of this month. So I will be scheduling a bunch of uploads. If you want to get access to all of those gameplays and sort of informational videos, you can become a member and get access to them right away. A bunch of them are scheduled already, actually. I've been grinding away at it. You can just click the join button down below the video or on my channel's homepage so that you too can show your devotion. And as always, I would love it if you could just tap that subscribe button, because then you'll stay up to date on all of the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general Magic content from me. See you at MXP.